This is Socially Triggered, and this video, you might see it starts with me looking at Google, and I want to show you uh, the problems with white culture. And what inspired this video is really Mr. Reagan, who is another YouTuber who did a video on the problems with black culture. And I think it's sometimes a very bad thing to look at other cultures and say, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong with those cultures without first looking at your own culture and seeing what are the problems within your own culture. And this video is really my attempt to respond to his video, but also to identify some of the problems that I see with white culture. And I really want to get into those problems because if we can solve these problems, I think they are the biggest problems in our world today. And the first big problem, and this is probably actually the biggest of all the problems, is what I'm going to search for right now. White guilt. So when we do, I'm going to just click on images. You'll see like what people, when you search for white guilt, you'll see like, I'll show some of these other things. You'll see discrimination, white people just putting themselves acting like slaves. You'll see like generally all the people have all these, like these are all the memes almost about white culture, about the way people feel about white culture, that they feel a real guilt for being white. And that's actually been sort of a problem. But why? Why do white people feel guilty about being white? And one of the reasons that we were always given is that we're told from a very early age that white people are the cause of all the problems in the world. We were told that, oh, it was white people that enslaved other people. It was white people that went around colonizing other people. And this is one of the biggest problems. Like we're told this stuff, but it's not necessarily true. Another thing that we're told is Columbus, he came across the ocean, he killed all the people that were living in North and South America, and he basically did a genocide. This is the things that we're told. And it's one of those things that, it's pervasive. It gets into the mindset. It gets into the culture of white people where it's embedded into the way that they think, that they feel like, oh, this real tremendous guilt. And it's a real problem. So I'm going to just sort of address some of this white guilt and hopefully alleviate some of it because we don't have to feel guilty about these things. For example, slavery. Slavery was a practice that all the peoples in the world were practicing. And it was only white people who actually made the initiative to get rid of slavery. There was a movement in China, actually, I have to correct myself on this, that there was a movement in China to abolish slavery, but it only lasted for a short term and then they went back to slavery. So it was, there was attempts in the past by other nations to abolish slavery, but it was really white Europeans and Americans who actually fought for the abolition of slavery and made it so that the rest of the world had to follow those rules. When we went to colonize, we actually pushed slavery out of those countries that we colonized. So if you looked at Africa, one of the narratives that we're always told is, oh, we stole all these people from Africa, we enslaved them and all that kind of stuff. That is not the truth. That did not happen. We never enslaved people. Now you think, wow, wait. There was 4 million slaves in America, right? That's true, but we didn't enslave them. How is that possible? How do those two things not make, how do they work together? Well, what happened was, in Africa, there was chieftains, and they would fight between their different clans or groups, and they would enslave anyone who was defeated. So they would have huge number of slaves. They would conquer like whole nations amongst themselves. And those slaves became a very valuable commodity. These kingdoms would basically take their slaves and sell them to people that would buy them. They would sell them to either themselves within their nations, or they would sell them on the coast of Africa to the white slave owners, slave buyers, I should say. So what happened is, like, we didn't actually enslave them. It wasn't like we went and rounded up the black people and enslaved them. They were already slaves. Now, I didn't say this is good practice. I didn't say this is a wonderful thing, but it's a big misunderstanding to think that should be feel guilty about the fact that we had done something to other people when it was a very common practice at the time. I actually listened to audio tapes of black slaves in the South, and it was very interesting. Just the way they talked about their slave owners. It was actually kind of insane to listen to these people because they had such reverence for their slave owners. It was weird. And they talked about their slave owners as almost like somebody where they would almost want to be slaves even in the afterlife to their slave owners. It was very strange. I don't think this is I wouldn't recommend slavery. I'm glad that it's been removed. It's just sort of weird. And I think there was a difference in the way slaves were treated in North America compared to some of the other areas. In the much larger slave trade was the Arab slave trade. And the reason you don't see blacks very often in Arabic countries is that what they would do is they would take the Africans and they would bring them to like Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, and basically they would castrate them. Now most of them would die actually from the process because back then they didn't have proper proper surgical techniques, and they would die. But the ones that lived would become eunuchs, and they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So they'd make good slaves for their Arabs. So that was the much larger, like 10 times larger slave trade that happened in the Middle East. In contrast, the North American slave trade was about 400,000 slaves that were brought over to North America. And what happened was they were treated reasonably well. I'm not saying perfect, but what happened was at that time, even if you weren't a slave and you did some small crime or even something very simple, it was very harsh treatment. You would get beaten beaten either as a slave or as just a regular folk person, because that was the way it was. It was very harsh times. So it was not uncommon that when slaves did something bad, that there was very harsh treatment of them. And that was sort of the way people treated each other back then. It wasn't a good thing. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm not trying to justify it. But the point is, a lot of the slaves were treated better than they would have probably been treated elsewhere. And we shouldn't feel guilty for those past wrongs. It was a practice that was held all over the world. It's still practiced in Africa to this day, where there's more slaves now in Africa today than there were even at the height of slavery in North America. So we shouldn't feel guilty about this. If anything, we should feel some kind of pride in the respect that we were the ones that tried to abolish slavery throughout the world. And we saved thousands or millions of lives that would have been destroyed by the effects of slavery. So I just want to make that clear, that we shouldn't feel this guilt. Another thing we shouldn't feel guilt about is colonialization. If you look at Africa, or you look at the places that we actually colonized, what happened was Europeans, they spent a fairly short amount of time. We're talking 100 to 200 years in most of the African countries. It was actually not because they didn't want to go there earlier. It was just impossible to go to Africa earlier than that. What would happen is it was brutal. Going to Africa meant a very high chance that you would die because of malaria. It was a very brutal situation. Africa was almost impossible to visit as a European because of the fact that malaria was so prevalent. So it was like a no-go zone for Europeans. And what happened was, if you looked at the population of Africa, it was always just sort of replacement levels. They would have lots of children, but most of them would die, and the population would never go up because life was incredibly bad in Africa for the Africans. And it improved under colonialism. The rule of law, the institutions that were brought over to Africa actually improved the lives of people in Africa. And that's why we see this explosive growth in Africa, of the economies there, of the populations there. And it's because of the fact that Europeans went over and really taught them many new things like medicine, modern medicine, rules of law, how to build proper homes, how to the wheel, written text. We taught them many things, and we actually improved the lives of Africans. Now, I'm not saying that colonialism was without its flaws. I mean, there was a lot of abuses that happened under it. But for the most part, it was a positive experience in many ways for the people there in the long term. Now, Africa is still a bit of a mess, but the point is, it only became a mess after the colonists left, and the countries kind of started reverting back to the way that they were before the colonialist times. The countries that actually are doing well in Africa now kind of maintained a lot of the systems that the colonialists had brought in, and it really did stabilize those countries. So these are the myths that we're taught, and it causes this white guilt, and it's one of the biggest problems with the white culture is this sense of white guilt. Another myth that we're taught is the fact that Columbus came over and he killed all the people, killed all the natives. There's some truth in that, because what happened was when the Europeans first came over, they brought diseases, and they didn't know that they were bringing diseases. It wasn't a deliberate attempt. But what happened was they brought over diseases. And the disease that they brought over that was really deadly was smallpox. And it ravaged through the whole North and South American populations. And they figure it was anywhere from 90 to 95% of the people died. I mean, it was not a genocide, because genocide is deliberate action, but it was definitely like an apocalypse for the people, because all of a sudden their world was going crazy. I mean, people were just dying. There was actually a reverse transmission back to Europe of what's it called? Of syphilis, which killed millions of Europeans. So there was a bit of trade in terms of diseases, but it was not intentional on either side. The difference was that the diseases the Europeans brought, the Europeans had built up immunity to those diseases, and they basically didn't realize that they were they were carriers of diseases, and they transmitted it to the people in the South American area. So what happened was, because they're bringing it direct contact, it caused problems. Whereas the diseases that the North and South American natives gave to the Europeans, well, those diseases either killed the Europeans very quickly, so that they didn't make it across on the way back to Europe, so that they could transmit it to the rest of European cultures and peoples. So it was only the slower, like the more long-term deadly diseases like syphilis that were able to make it back to Europe and kill the people back in Europe. So it was a different kind of method of transmitting diseases, and that led to different numbers of people dying. Had the natives been the ones to travel to Europe, probably you would have seen like lots of people die in Europe from native diseases. But instead, it was a slow transmission that happened to Europe. So it wasn't like there was any deliberate genocide, there wasn't any intent. The one big one that they cite, which happened actually hundreds of years later, was the whole smallpox blanket thing. Well, you can't actually transmit smallpox from blankets. And it was done with 10 blankets, I think. And it was more of a snub than it was actually of a attempt to really uh, kill off the natives. And it was like a very, it had no effect. It was just one of those, but it was one of those stories that got perpetuated to make it a myth that this is how all interaction happened between the Europeans and the North American natives, and it was just not true. That was like one incident out of many interactions that happened, and it wasn't even something that actually detrimentally impacted the native population. So these are the narratives that we're taught, though, and it gets embedded in us, and we feel this guilt that we can't overcome. And it's really important to understand that we don't have to feel guilt for what we have done. We should actually feel a sense of pride for the many things that we have contributed to society. White European populations have really contributed to the world. They figure like 99% of all modern inventions are from Europe and in America. And these are things that have changed people's lives, like, and made the world the modern world it is. And this is something we can be proud of as a community and not feel shame for. And even the things that we've done wrong, we shouldn't feel shame in even the specter of slavery or colonialism or any of those things, because it really wasn't the way that it's been projected by the media or by the educational systems. It just isn't that bad. It wasn't the way that they're trying to make it sound. Even the whole concept, another big one that inspires white guilt is that they say that the Europeans came over and they stole the land of the natives. Well, that's actually not true either. Land is always in a constant battle. People are always trying to capture land. And if you looked at the map or the landscape of North America, the natives were at constant war with each other. They were just battling it out. They had alliances, they had all the intrigue that Europe had. Europe was doing the same stuff. We were, groups of people always fight with each other. It's a fun thing that we love to do as humans. But the point is, they were fighting. They were all trying to take each other's land. And when the Europeans came over, the natives embraced them, actually, for the most part, because they saw that these Europeans had new technology that they could use to fight their enemies. So they saw, hey, this is an opportunity. If we make friends with these people, maybe we can use their guns to kill off our enemies. So they didn't realize that there was more Europeans coming. And they sort of brought in, they allowed the Europeans, and they actually worked with the Europeans a lot without realizing that, hey, maybe this might not go well for them once more and more Europeans come. So that's the problem with immigration. But a lot of these Europeans, when came, they were actually welcomed by the natives. And it's a lesson for us to learn that small amounts of immigration can work, it can be a benefit to the society. But when you have huge amounts of immigration, well, things can backfire and you lose the very land that you believe that you're controlling and gaining. And these natives, they learned that. And at the end, they were fighting against it, but it was too late. And we don't want to make that same mistake where we don't want to lose the things that made our nations the great places that they are. We don't want to have white guilt be thrusted upon us that will generally erode the success that we have in our nations. Because if we believe that our culture is fundamentally flawed, that it's evil or whatever, then we're going to be embracing the very destruction of that culture. And that's the problem with white guilt. It is really that destruction of the culture, that we're almost perpetuating our own deaths and demise. And that's not the way we should live. So this is the problem I see with white culture, this whole concept of white guilt. And I showed you some of the memes. You can see them on the screen. You've probably been reading them as I'm talking to you. And I think that white guilt is one of those things that's destroying our societies, and it's destroying our world because it's allowing us to make really bad decisions that are self-destructing, that we're allowing mass immigration, we're allowing the people that haven't really understood the value of white culture and European culture to basically change the culture without understanding how good the culture really was. And this is the important lesson that we have to learn, that we have to take pride to a certain extent in our culture and be thankful for European culture. Even if you're of some other culture, you have to realize that there's lots of benefits to the cultures that Europeans have built. The only reason people are coming to North America or Europe is the cultures have produced really great societies. And instead of trying to break those down by changing those cultures, we should embrace those cultures and maybe even export those cultures to other parts of the world. Now, I don't actually recommend that cultures shift over to European model because each culture has to find what works best for them. But to destroy white culture and European culture is fundamentally wrong on many, many levels. And I hope that this all makes sense. I hope that people appreciate this video. And I hope that this is my call to people to stop feeling guilt about being white, because a lot of bad things come out of feeling guilt, and guilt for things that we had nothing to do with. So this has been Socially Triggered. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please check out my other videos, not always such a touchy topic. And I hope that you subscribe, and please give me your feedback. If you think that white guilt is deserving, tell me. If you think white guilt is a real problem in our society, tell me. I want to hear your feedback. Let's have a discussion about this. Thank you for listening.